Prescribed fire is a great wildlife habitat management tool. It may seem odd to talk about using fire to improve habitat. Many of us remember the big Smokey the Bear campaign, which basically all fire in woodlands or native habitat areas was bad. And that was appropriate at that time when wildfires were just raging all across the United States. But today, in more modern wildlife management, prescribed fire is one of the best tools we have in that bag to improve habitat. I like to use the word prescribed fire versus just fire or controlled burn because it implies exactly what it is. It's a prescription to achieve a goal of improving the health or increasing the quality of the habitat. With the prescription, there's always directions or recommendations, and that's true with prescribed fire. We're going to use certain conditions, wind speed, humidity, whatever that is, to control that fire and make sure it meets our objective. It's not as simple as saying, it's a good day today, I'm going to go out there and drop a match and see what happens. A prescribed fire is really something that's well thought out and planned to meet an objective on a particular area or a particular habitat type. I mentioned the Smokey the Bear campaign. When I was in college, I was on a wildfire crew for the Bureau of Land Management stationed out of Elko, Nevada. And we would get a call to go out and put out wildfires. These were often started by dry lightning or lightning storms with no rain, or some equipment caused a spark, a railroad track caused a spark, and started an unprescribed fire. This would burn without control and where a fire wasn't wanted. There's a huge difference between a wildfire that's burning without control and no plan and a prescribed fire that started to create a specific objective or to create a certain habitat type. It's important to remember that in places like California and Arizona and western Texas, oftentimes that daily humidity is below 10% or so. But throughout much of the whitetails range, the eastern states in particular, from Missouri on east, gosh, if we get up and the humidity is 30%, we go, it feels like a great day today. We just don't have those super low humidities like we see where the giant wildfires occur. Humidity is such a big factor in fire because fine fuels like leaves or grasses, especially dying or dead grasses, are sponges. And even a change in humidity can determine whether those fuels will carry a fire or they'll smolder or they won't even burn at all. So for example, if it's that 8% humidity like often occurs out west, boy, if a little spark hits some grass or leaves, that fire's off and running. If you're in the eastern area, again, Missouri on east, and you're at 50% humidity, oftentimes the fire won't even carry. You're trying to light the fire to achieve an objective, and it just won't sustain itself. It puts itself out because the fine fuels necessary to carry fire have too much moisture to maintain that fire. That is not to say that fire was not a part of habitat throughout much of the United States. Nothing could be further from the truth. The records clearly show that Native Americans used fire to improve habitat, to draw bison and elk into their area, as a war tool to maybe set back a neighboring tribe that's encroaching on their area. There were lightning strikes all over. There's been some great research at several universities looking at scars in older trees to determine the frequency of fire long before settlement in the United States. We know from the early explorers that fire-maintained habitat was extremely productive. Not just Lewis and Clark, there were little explorers everywhere, trappers, people looking for lead deposits or even gold mines, and they would keep a journal, much like Lewis and Clark, although they're not near as well publicized. And all of these journals I've read talk about fire throughout many states. And that fire, even these early explorers would say, boy, I saw a fire scar and this year the grass is as tall as my horseback and there are bison and elk everywhere. Fire is an extremely natural part of habitat management even before European settlement. But today, where we have all these fire breaks, roads and reservoirs, and our forests have matured, they're not a grassland anymore, we can still use fire to improve habitat on a site-specific basis, and there are many, many benefits of using that tool. First and foremost, fire consumes fuel on the ground, maybe that's dead leaves and grasses, sticks and whatnot, and can allow the sun to get down there and cause new growth. And most species really prefer that new succulent growth over mature growth. Many of the game and non-game species are dependent on that fire type. I can remember there was an endangered species of a sparrow in Florida years ago, and it was determined on Forest Service land that the prevention of fire had decreased habitat quality for that species, and to conserve that endangered species, they reintroduced fire into that area. That's just one of many examples. In addition to consuming the dead fuel and allowing new plants to grow, fire encourages some plants and sets back other species. It almost always encourages the native species to that area. There are some pine species, for example, that have what's called serotinous cones. It takes a fire to open up that cone and stimulate the seeds to grow. There are other species that need to be scarred by fire for them to germinate. A big one of my favorite ones, is when you're reading these early explorers, Lewis and Clark and others, I've never read where they mention ticks. Imagine that, walking, going by river or whatever, from St. Louis to the West Coast and back without mentioning a tick. Heck, a lot of us can't walk out into our yard without looking for ticks. Well, fire is a great way to reduce tick populations. We know that all species increase or decrease based on the habitat quality for that species. Well, ticks need a lot of moisture. Fire obviously removes moisture from the landscape, so it causes those ticks to desiccate, and without moisture, they perish rapidly. Now, just burning a 3-acre area behind your house will probably not get rid of all the ticks for long term. It will remove ticks in the short term, but as that area starts greening back up, deer, rabbits, and other species will start feeding there more than the non-burn areas, and ticks will fall off those critters and repopulate the area. So a rotation of prescribed fire is a really good way, not just a one-time fire, but a rotation through the years is a great way to reduce tick populations in your area. Rotating fire doesn't mean I'm burning this year and 3 years later and 3 years later at the same time. There's a lot of variables with fire, and scientists have learned that when you do a dormant season fire, a fire when plants aren't growing, think, from winter till spring, that dormant period, that usually causes certain species of plants to respond. And when you do a growing season fire, often that's late summer, but it could get dry in June. When plants are greened up, but we get in a dry period and a fire will carry, other species of plants respond to being burned at that time. I've noticed in my work, and other researchers have documented, that one of the best ways to increase both plant and animal species diversity is by burning at different times of year. Don't just burn the same piece every 3 years in March. Maybe that first rotation you burn in March, a dormant season fire, removing all the dead fuel and stuff. And the next time there's enough fuel to carry a fire, hopefully it's a late season burn or a midsummer burn, and you get a dry period and that will burn. Here's some real simple illustrations of why you get a much more diverse species community, a plant community coming on when you burn at different types of year. If you think of grasses, they tend to mature real late in the summer and hold their seed throughout much of the winter. If you burn in that late winter, February, March, whatever, and you burn those grasses, they're going to drop their seeds, and you just burned all the duff off the ground. That's creating a perfect seed bed for that seed to fall on, germinate, and grow. A lot of flowering plants, broadleaf plants, we would call forbs, some really good ones like partridge pea, cinseed briar, all kind of really cool plants. Well, they form seeds more in the summer. So if you burn right when they're maturing their seed, that seed's going to fall to the ground on a fresh seed bed without all the competing grasses and weeds and leaves in there, and that can grow. It's easy to see that burning at different times of year will create a more diverse plant community, and a more diverse plant community is very healthy for many species. Again, it's a prescribed fire. There's a prescription, and part of that prescription is you don't remove all the cover in an area at one time. So we typically don't burn an entire property, you know, let's say from border A to border B at one time. We want to make a diversity out there, and that diversity not only is different species, but different maturity of the species. So we're going to burn in blocks. Let's say we divide a property in 4 or 5 different blocks, and we burn 2 blocks this year and 1 block the next year and maybe 2 more blocks the following year. We've always got this young, medium, and the older succession of plants or maturity of plants in close proximity at one time. That is ideal habitat. We don't want to burn 75 miles at one time. That'd be catastrophic. Our prescription of burning the same block at different times a year throughout the years, or adjacent blocks in a rotation, serves more than creating a really diverse habitat quality. It also allows hunters to create different areas that will attract critters at different times a year or different times throughout the season. When you burn at different times of the year, you get different food sources growing up, and deer will use this food source when they need acorns, for example, or when they want green vegetation. We can think about creating turkey nesting habitat, turkey brooding habitat, all by the rotation of our fire. We can attract turkeys to use in our property by creating those certain types of habitat through the use of fire. This is not only a wildlife habitat management tool that we think is relegated only to biologists, it's also a tool to make better habitat for patterning game and hunting. Prescribed fire is a great tool in many ways besides improving the habitat for wildlife. It can be used to remove fuel under very controlled conditions, so you're not worried about a wildfire during drought conditions. When you're putting all this together, it's important to remember that if you're using this to improve wildlife habitat and you're in a closed canopy forest, simply removing the leaf litter off the floor won't yield great results because these new plants that are growing require the sun's energy to grow. So as part of this process, you may need in some areas to reduce the amount of trees in an area and allow some sun to reach the forest floor. And later in this series, we're going to share some techniques that go under the category of what we call TSI, timber stand improvement, where you can safely leave the best trees and remove the lower quality trees or invasive species trees, once again improving the wildlife habitat, and in this case allowing more sun to reach the forest floor and that energy to cause good quality plants to grow. All this talk about fire, I'd really be remiss if I didn't talk about the need for training and using this tool safely, just like a chainsaw or a weed eater. They're great tools, but you need to use them safely. The same is really true for prescribed fire. Many state agencies, both wildlife agencies and forestry agencies, offer training either free at a really small price to get you comfortable with using fire in your habitat. Most of them go through the whole process of creating a fire plan, what weather patterns mean, talk about fire burning faster uphill than downhill, and I strongly encourage you to attend one of these classes and just assist on some prescribed fires before you go out to your property and do a fire on your own. Understanding fire's role as far as improving wildlife habitat is a great way to get outside and enjoy creation. Stay tuned to this series as we're going to be sharing more techniques to improve wildlife habitat quality.